Hello, everybody, and welcome. So we'll be waiting a few minutes just for people to arrive. Hello, welcome. So welcome, everybody. Just if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Just say who you are, what your interest in languages is, maybe. That would be wonderful. Hello, welcome. Do introduce yourself in the chat and just tell us who you are, what your interest in the language show and languages is. You'll find the chat bottom at the bottom of your screen. Hello, welcome. Hello, Inka. Lovely. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Please do introduce yourselves. Otherwise, I feel like I'm on my own. Adele from Edinburgh. Nice to meet you. German financial translation. That's very precise. Thank you. Great range of languages. Chris, thank you. Hello, everyone. Do introduce yourselves in the chat. Hello, Luke. I'm in France too. I'm in Paris. So we'll just wait a moment or two as the numbers are going up pretty consistently, actually, which is good. Hello, Florence. Are you all based in the UK, or are you some Luke's in France? Anyone else in different places? Italian and Greek. It's quite a challenge. Hello, welcome, Regina. Irina, you're from Cambridge. I'm from Cambridge originally. I'm from Ely, near Cambridge. Or Little Downham, near Ely, near Cambridge. Thank you, Yinka. Hello, welcome, everybody. Just one more minute and we'll get started. Thank you. Very interesting, Nora Jane. Do introduce yourselves. Hello, Pescalina. Wow. Italian, Greek, Spanish, and Latvian. These are great combinations. Okay, so let's get started. So welcome, everybody. My name's George. I'm the head of English programs at the British Council in France. I'm here today in a rainy, dull, miserable looking Paris. But I'm very, very pleased to be in the language show. And I'm very, very pleased to be here talking to you about something I feel quite passionate about. And that was the subject of my master's degree, was the subject of a lot of the work I do promoting positive multilingual um, uh, language environments, language ecosystems in France as part of the British Council's work. So a few housekeeping details. This session is, of course, being recorded and it will be available on the website for other people to see. Please do interact. I'll try and keep the chat open on my screen. So please do talk and tell me things as we go along. There's a Q&A button. At the end, there'll be lots of times for you to ask me questions. So please do put the questions in the Q&A. I'll be dealing with them at the end just because I can't see that many things on my screen at once. Wonderful. Adele, you're going to be able to correct my Breton pronunciation as we go along. Wonderful. So, thank you very much. Let's get started. First of all, I'm going to share with you a little poll. I'd just like to know a little bit more about who you are and what your interest is today. So if you could just fill in the poll for me. Goodness. I forget that you can't see the results, but they're very interesting. I'll share them with you in a moment. Okay, great. So one last moment. Okay, so we've got a good range of people here. We've got some teachers, some translators, some language enthusiasts, and some language teachers. So that's brilliant. Okay, well, I'll be keeping a record of that. But as I was saying, my name is George Wilson. I'm the head of English programs at the British Council in France. I'm very pleased to be here. Today, I'm here to talk to you about a subject that's very close to my heart, but which essentially can be resumed in the word death. I'm here to talk to you about language death. This is what language death looks like. It's a plaque fixed to the tomb of a woman called Dolly Pentreath, and she was purportedly the last recorded native speaker of the Cornish language. When she died in 1777, to all intents and purposes, her language died with her. Now, language death is a huge issue around the world today, with UNESCO estimating that half of the world's 8,000 spoken languages are actually at risk of becoming extinct. I mean, that's a mind-numbing figure. Half of the languages in the world are at risk of becoming extinct. In Europe, the situation is actually very, very serious, particularly serious. And today I'd like to talk to you about the reasons for the decline of regional languages, the shift in attitudes towards protecting these languages, and the efforts that are being made to revitalize them. So, as I said before, we'll have time for questions at the end, but do make comments as we go along. So the first part of my talk today is all about decline. My own interest in this topic was born out of conversations with my mum. Now, I come from the area of the UK where I think I'm probably furthest from any regional language in East Anglia near Cambridge. But my mum is from Wales, and her story is very simply that her grandparents spoke only Welsh. Her parents were bilingual, but she only speaks English. Now, that set me to wondering what could possibly have happened to cause such a staggering decline in just 3 generations. Well, it turns out, oh, sorry, I've realized I'm not showing my screen, am I? Let me just rectify that. Oops, sorry. Share screen. Great. Hopefully you can see that now. Sorry about that. Oops. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So, hopefully you can see my screen now. Just let me know in the chat if you can. Yes, you can. Brilliant. So, what could possibly have caused? Let me just show you. This is Dolly Pentreath's tomb in Cornwall. But going on, what could possibly cause such a decline in 3 generations that we could move from a family being monolingual to bilingual to monolingual again in the other direction? Well, it turns out it's a really common story across Europe, and it's been replicated for over the last few centuries, and it's continuing today. Just in the chat, can you tell me if any of you speak a regional language, a language essentially that's predates or is alongside your national language in your own territory? So tell me, is anyone a Welsh speaker or a Manx speaker? Ah, brilliant. Great. I'm quite jealous. Brilliant. So we've got Breton not being passed down, Creole. Oh, brilliant. Okay, great. This is hugely relevant to you then. So today we're going to use France as an example. We're going to use France as an example of how this kind of decline has taken place over the last 200 years. Metropolitan France, obviously France is a lot more than just metropolitan France, and there are even more languages. But metropolitan France has around 21 regional languages. That is the languages that had traditionally existed before or alongside French on the territory. And we're talking about some great languages. You can see them here, but you can also see examples such as Occitan. So Occitan was the language of the princely courts of Europe and of high literature in the 12th century. We're talking about Basque, which is the oldest language on the European continent. Its origins are so unique and so shrouded in mystery that we don't even know where it comes from. And of course, we're talking about Breton, which, like other Celtic languages in the British Isles, has kind of clung on to that rocky western shore of Europe. It's resisted all the invasions and the population migrations. But today, it's in danger. And in fact, all of the languages of France are classed as vulnerable or endangered, according to UNESCO. So how did this happen? The story behind their decline is intimately linked with the idea of state building. It comes from the birth of France as a nation with that foundational moment, the French Revolution. Indeed, the revolutionaries, they saw a need to build a single, homogenized, unified French state. And it would be unified under one revolutionary government. So you had to suppress dissent and bring everyone in line. In 1794, l'Abbé Grégoire published his report on the necessity and the means to annihilate local languages and to universalize the use of French. And there's a really important quote, I think, from Bertrand Barrère de Vieuzac, who declared in his speech to the Revolutionary Convention, so you've got this picture of ardent revolutionaries cheering him on, "Federalism and superstition speak Breton. Emigration and hate of the Republic speak German. The counter-revolution speaks Italian, and fanaticism speaks Basque. Let us smash these faulty and harmful instruments. Citizens, a free nation should have a single language which is used by all." It's quite strong stuff, but it really underlines this link between nation building and unifying language. There were two main ways that the revolutionary government identified in order to do this. The first was excluding regional languages from the public sphere. So that meant depriving them of their prestige, depriving them of their role in society. And the second was education. The education system in France was to use only one language. And so as access grew over the century that followed, with more and more laws universalizing education and spreading it across the different regions, so too did the education system's ability to impose French as the language, the one language of the nation. This mission is captured in one French official's reminder, which perfectly sums it up. This is from 1845. "Remember that you have been posted here exclusively to kill the Breton language." Not only was the language forbidden in schools, but children who spoke it were made to wear a symbol or a symbol. You can see it in the picture. This symbol was designed to humiliate them. It could have been a slipper, it could have been something around the neck, a ribbon. If they spoke the regional language, they had to wear the symbol. The only way to get rid of the symbol was to denounce someone else for speaking the regional language. And at the end of the day, the child who still had the symbol was beaten. So the academic Judge in her book kind of aptly sums this up. She said these strategies were particularly effective because they acted on the community's social psychology and fostered a sense of hatred towards one's language, leading to a feeling of internalized alienation and eventually linguicide. It's generally agreed that disrupted transmission to children, in the words of Grenoble and Whaley, can move a vital language to near extinction in the course of a single generation. And we see that. We see it all the time. My family is an example. This is what happened in France. Slowly but surely, French became the language of aspiration and conformity, and parents stopped transmitting their mother tongues to their children. For example, Breton was the main language of Brittany until the 20th century. But in 2016, it was only spoken by 304,000. Its speaker base is set to shrink by another 79% in the next 30 years. Because quite simply, the average age of a Breton speaker is over 60. This crisis facing regional languages in France is therefore urgent and acute. But France's approach to linguistic conformity was far from unique. And a similar process happened in Britain with languages, as you said in the chat, such as Welsh. In Wales, the Education Act of 1870 imposed schooling purely through English. Even though that rule was then tempered in 1890, education had become a hostile kind of environment for the language. Shame was instilled in speakers, and it was stripped of its prestige. And the consequence was the familiar decline in speaker numbers, the inevitable loss of domains of use. In 1911, there were 977,000 Welsh speakers, but that number fell to a low point of 504,000 in 1981. Okay, that's the really depressing part done. Because luckily, things have begun to shift. They did begin to shift in the second half of the 20th century. Attitudes shifted towards regional languages, towards bilingualism, and there was increasing movement to protect and promote regional languages in France, in the UK, and of course more widely across Europe. I love that somebody said this is upsetting. I'll try and get a more cheerful vibe going. So there were various reasons why things began to change. First of all, our understanding of multilingualism changed. Previously, there'd been a perception that the learning of more than one language didn't necessarily lead to bilingualism, but led to what was called semilingualism. The idea that it would harm a child's cognitive development and linguistic skills. Luckily, in the 1960s, 70s, there were studies that gradually disproved this and showed that, in fact, the opposite was true. There were cognitive benefits to studying more than one, or to speaking more than one language and being multilingual. In the UK and in France, there was also an increasing shift politically. If we think about the socialists coming to power in France and devolution in the 1990s, we see a decentralization in the UK. We see a decentralization of power. And what I found in my research was that there was a clear alignment between efforts to revive regional languages and having autonomy over regional language or education policy within a territory. So in Wales, for example, there are clear targets for regional languages because the government's zone corresponds to the zone where the language is spoken. So decentralization is always a good thing, really, for regional language policy. The third, as you can see from the picture, was a shift in international laws and conventions. Things like the Council of Europe's Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, which began to apply normative pressure to governments to say, this is a human right. You should be able to speak the language you were born with. And so that increasing pressure has impacted on different countries, although France has never actually signed it. There's also, perhaps the fourth reason, a growing desire to preserve regional identities, perhaps enhanced by globalization. When we feel like everywhere is the same, we start to kind of dig in and resist. And it was interesting. I remember reading about the case of Manx on the Isle of Man. And in fact, the most strident supporters of the language are often people who come into the region, not people who were born there, because they're searching for that regional identity. That's why they've chosen it. It's also in the 80s, in particular, in the early 90s, with the Conservative government in the UK, there was a real realization that you could actually grow tourism by highlighting regional languages. This kind of neoliberal approach that became known as regional particularism. So buying trinkets that have regional language things on, looking at signposts that have different languages, it helps to give that sense of special regional identity that helps draw tourists to a different area. And finally, I guess the other reason for this change in attitude was to some extent linked to a growing awareness that when a language dies, it's more than the language that dies. For example, the word, excuse my pronunciation, glace in Breton is a color. It's a color. It's not blue. It's not green. It's a color that's associated with the idea of life. So when you're describing a forest, you can use this word. But when you're describing the sea, you can also use this word. And it captures that idea of the essence of life being linked to the visual appearance. Now that's fascinating. But it's also unique to that culture, or maybe not unique, but particular to that culture. When a language dies, we lose some of that cultural inheritance. We lose a link with a sense of place and history. And we lose more than individual sounds and words. We lose a history, a culture. A growing realization of that was arguably behind some of the drive to preserve languages as well. Just going to read one of the comments in the chat. Yes, so we're going to come on to that. That's really interesting. Okay, so the more fun bit. There's this realization that we need to protect regional languages. So how did we set about doing that? How can we best protect and revitalize them? Now, the goal of any revitalization program has to be to restore intergenerational transmission. But influencing family behavior is super difficult. In fact, in many cases, that's impossible because it's a private sphere. However, various techniques can be adopted to create an environment that's favorable to these languages. So this is where I'm going to ask you to do some work. Tell me, what if you were reviving a language, what would you do to try and improve its chances? Questions on a postcard or questions in the chat? Or not questions, statements, thoughts? What kinds of things? Okay. Great. Any other ideas? Yeah, great. Conduct life in it. I like that. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we're doing the easy bit. We're doing the blue sky thinking. I guess it's hard to bring these things into existence. But yes, yes. Great. Thank you. So yeah, some of the things you can do, you've put your finger on it. You can make the languages visible. So if you go to Wales, you'll see signs in Welsh. Documents, official documents are increasingly in Welsh. You can create jobs, as somebody said in the chat. Now, creating jobs, for example, in Ireland, Irish was a condition for the civil service for many years. That's a way in which the language has an importance. I don't know if anyone mentioned it, but media is a big one. If you can listen to radio in the language, if you can watch TV in the language, I think Wales has some great soap operas, doesn't it? in somebody who's Welsh tell me. I think there are soap operas in Welsh in Wales. Um, and of course, making sure that websites are available in these languages. We all use websites all day, every day. So if they're not there, that's very difficult. But great, thank you. Yes. Ah, great. BBC in Cornish. Brilliant. So these strategies alone, however, are not enough to revitalize a language. They're a gesture, but they're important. What is essentially needed if you can't influence too strongly what's happening in the family is education, which is slightly ironic because education was used to destroy these languages, but now it's become the main tool of their savior, of their revitalization. So the real focus of revitalization tends to be in the education system. It's all language education sits on a continuum, really, with your classic school learning at one end, where you learn it as a school subject, and right at the other end, immersion education, where everything you do in the school is mediated through the language. So if you go to a Welsh immersion school, all your subjects are taught in Welsh. If you go to a Breton immersion school, all taught in Breton. Now, there are lots of variants along that cline. In the middle, you've got things like teaching, merging content and language in what we call CLIL. You've got various other ways of partial immersion and so on. But essentially, if we think about the efficacy of that cline, I studied German for 2 years at school as a subject. I can't really speak German. So, I mean, it often learning a language at school as a second language is more of a symbolic gesture than actually necessarily going to lead to fluent speakers. Not always. I also studied French and I live in France, but still, it's not the best way of changing an entire generational linguistic approach. Immersion education, on the other hand, is capable of producing speakers who can speak the language as fluently as a native speaker. So for that reason, immersion education is all important in language revitalization. And there are some really good, ambitious examples of such programs. Now, I've realized I can't say this word, and I've realized that nobody ever wants to talk to me about regional languages. So although I write about them quite a lot, I don't get to use the words very often, but I'll do my best. One such program is the Welsh Cymraeg 2025 strategy, which includes a strategy for Wales that to increase the number of Welsh immersion schools so as to try and reach a target of 1 million speakers by 2050. So that's one ambitious program that exists to try and increase speaker numbers through education. However, there are definitely challenges facing immersion education. Cymraeg, thank you. So there are definitely challenges facing immersion education. Ideological ones, to begin with. In France, for instance, that idea of a Jacobite ideology that everyone should be doing the same thing at the same time is still hugely influential. The Ministry of Education still believes very strongly in French as the language of instruction. And the Constitution still talks about French as the language of France. So in France, you haven't necessarily got that political will in all places, in many other countries as well. There's also difficulties around resources. When you're training teachers to speak and teach in a language, they need training. You need to help have materials for them. And it's often, in fact, I'd contend in my work, that it's not about translating existing materials necessarily. We're not trying to teach in a language, we're trying to teach through a language. So it's really important that we actually have resources, training, support to support teachers in their efforts. There's also structural elements. Do the exams and qualifications exist in the regional language? If they don't, the incentive to study all the way through your schooling to then do an exam in a different language is not really compelling. And another big problem with structure is often there are primary schools that are teaching immersion education in a regional language. But then what happens when they go to secondary school? The pupils then find themselves disconnecting from that system. Yeah, we're going to come to that. That's a really good point, Adele. So yes, exactly. You've got this idea that there's a huge danger of disconnect within the system. There's also language problems, linguistic problems. So if you think about Brittany, Breton is quite a nebulous idea in many ways because every kind of village had its own slight variation of the language. And so there wasn't one standard form of Breton that you could rely upon when teaching it. What were you teaching essentially? This version or this version or this version? Now, there's been a lot of effort to rectify that in the 1950s and so on. And they came up with a Neo-Breton form, which is what's used in the education system. But that causes huge problems in its own right because often complaints from traditional Breton speakers are that they can't really understand Neo-Breton speakers. And you end up with this kind of perception as well that one is educated Breton and one isn't, which can then further kind of reduce confidence in people's own native language ability. And of course, you've got pedagogical considerations. So, how can you use different languages in the same classroom? Wales is very pioneering in this, in the sense that they work often with translanguaging. They developed this idea of how you could give input in a class in one language, like a video or whatever, but then talk about it in another. So that's a very innovative idea around code switching. And that idea has kind of grown and expanded into different forms. But it's certainly a consideration that has to be given a lot of thought. What language are you speaking when? What age do you begin? And so on. So these challenges are real, but perhaps the biggest challenge, and I think somebody touched on this earlier, is that in fact, the language you learn in school is not enough. You have to make that link with the wider community, and people have to use the language outside of the classroom. So language education programs that are aiming to revitalize regional languages have to get people using it in the family, in the home, in the community. And as somebody said, you have to make it look cool. You have to make people want to use it. And there's an interesting study by two people, Price and Tamborelli, who suggested that in Wales, the language has become increasingly associated with the formal domain of education. And it's not the cool way of talking with your friends in the street or playing football. They also questioned the register. For example, if you're learning Welsh in a school, you're learning a more formal register that's ill-adapted to everyday use. So it's really hard, is the conclusion, I think. But education authorities, government authorities, local authorities are doing their utmost to really get the language going, to get a kind of effervescence around it. And there are lots of good initiatives, such as, for example, the Young Farmers Association in Brittany and in Wales all do a lot with that language. Summer camps in immersion, for example. There's a really nice initiative, which I think is great in Brittany, and it's pairing up Neo-Breton speakers from schools with traditional speakers so that they see the language being used in the community. So there's lots of different initiatives. One last challenge that you need for a successful language revitalization program, however, is that you need the support of the parents. And that can be really tricky when they themselves no longer speak the language. So you need initiatives, you need books, you need resources, and Wales, Brittany are both going a long way towards that. I love the title of this book, Help, My Child Speaks Breton. And it's in Wales, you've got Welsh for the Family, I think it's called, where there are systems to help parents learn Welsh at the same pace as their children. So there has to be this kind of accompaniment. So the good news, and I said I'd get to something positive, is that immersion programs are really beginning to take root and to bear fruit in Europe. The number of Welsh speakers is growing. There are currently about 562,000 Welsh speakers, and most significantly, the number of 3 and 4-year-olds speaking the language has increased. It was 11.3% in 1971 and it's now 23.6% in 2011. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with the Heimreich strategy, which aims for 1 million speakers in 2050, and whether the changes and the initiatives in the education system will help deliver that. In France, meanwhile, there was a really big and controversial decision taken a couple of years ago to allow full immersion education within the state system. Now, the decision was the result of a long battle, but it will now needs to be seen and tested whether that actually happens. But it's certainly a good step towards language revitalization. And indeed, if we go back to the wild coastlines of Cornwall, we find an encouraging story as well. We're talking on a small scale, but the language that died was gradually brought back to life by linguists in the 19th and 20th centuries. They dug it up, they plugged up the gaps with Breton and Welsh, and they sent it back out into the world. Today, there are schools teaching the language and all sorts of cultural initiatives taking roots. There are apps, there are adult learning classes, and most importantly, there are some, very few, but there are some families that are teaching Cornish as a first language to their children. So I think that if ever there was needed evidence, that's evidence in itself that regional languages can indeed be saved if there's sufficient political, educational, and above all, societal desire to do so. Regional languages are an important window into the past, but more than that, they're also a door to the future. Because plurilingualism is a huge social and cultural asset, and it can only be hoped that its value and its importance will be fully recognized in time so that we can save these precious languages. I've certainly got hope, or as I think they say in Cornish, Guvnik. Thank you. Great. So do keep in touch. There are some references here that you'll be able to look back on the video. But yeah, do keep in touch. I'd really like to hear more of your views, more of your ideas. I'm going to open the Q&A as well. So if you've got questions, probably the easiest thing is to put them in the chat now. And I'll do my best to answer them, or maybe someone else can. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. Just read through the comments while you're writing your questions. Yes. Great. Okay, brilliant. Any questions you'd like to ask? I hope you will learn Breton. I'm trying to learn Breton. I've got a book called Breton 5 Minutes a Day. It's not going very well, as you can tell. Thank you. Any questions? Anyone got any other comments they'd like to make? What can we do to change people's minds that the regional language is not equal to poor culture? That's a really interesting a really interesting question. I think a lot of it comes down to what they call status management. So prestige is associated very often with the public domain. So when you take a language out of the public domain, you remove a reason to learn it. You make it seem like what they call in French a dialect or a patois, rather than a real language, even if linguistically it is one. So it's about enhancing the status of the language as well. Oh, brilliant. Thank you for the notes about glass. I'm going to read those. Okay, any other questions there? Okay, let me go to the Q&A. So we've got a great question here. As globalization increases, borders are being removed, cultures are mixing, technology is advancing. How do we reconcile the importance of regional linguistic pride in a world which is emphasizing, I haven't got the end, unfortunately, but I presume it's emphasizing homogeneity. I think in some ways there's a pendulum swing, I would say. I would say that the more you end up with a situation of globalization, the more there's also a push to feel a sense of place. And that's something that comes through in immersion education. It's interesting, if you look at the private school network in France that often teaches regional languages more than the state system, and if you look at the associations that offer regional language teaching, their websites will often talk about enracinement or being rooted in the local culture. And I think that's a recognition that what what people are looking for is not just a language, they're looking for a sense of belonging. And I think that's something that regional languages are capable of doing. And it becomes more important when we have that sense of globalization. Do you think making a regional language compulsory in school is a good way to encourage people, or will it feel forced and be counterproductive? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. I don't know. In many ways, I think it's a good idea for people to have an awareness of regional identities, cultures, languages. But again, I don't think that will change. Studying the language as a second language is not going to change the language profile of a country or a region. You need immersion education for that. And for that, I think you probably need parental buy-in. So I think it's probably not a question of making it obligatory, but I think it's more a question of making it desirable. Okay. I'm a Russian speaker, and even though I don't think the language will die, I have a question about the political pressures of a language. What can we do to help people see the positive aspects of a language when the language experiences criticism due to a political situation? Hmm. I can't imagine anything worse than being singled out because of the language you're speaking, whether it be your language or whether it be a regional language. I think I'd like to think that languages transcend politics and they transcend specific geographical regions in many cases. I would like to think that even though there's no easy answer, institutions like the British Council, the Alliance Française, and so on, are here to kind of project an image of the value of learning languages, teaching languages effectively, doing arts in different languages, and having education exchange and so on. I'd like to think that that kind of initiative is an important way of enhancing the reputation of a language and its status politically. Certainly, that's what my role is in France. My role is to promote English as a tool for opportunity. Arguably, it's easier with English than with some other languages, but I think that's very much the role of such cultural institutions. Do you think there's more enthusiasm in France today for regional languages like Picard, for example, than there has been historically? Yes, I think so. There have been some changes in France that are important. There's now a part of the Ministry of Culture dedicated to the languages of France. There's been a shift in so much as the Constitution still maintains that French is the language of France, but it also recognizes the languages of France as well as important. So I think there's a political shift, but I think there's also a growing realization of the things I was talking about of the loss of culture, the loss of identity. And so I think there is that shift in France. You have things like France television that has elements and newspapers that are in the languages. And I'd like to think that those will gain in strength as people see it as cool and desirable. I think there's also an increasing recognition among parents that often regional language schools have smaller classes, and so that becomes quite a draw. And also because I think the evidence is so overwhelming now that the more languages you speak, the better your mental health, the better your kind of like cognition ends up being. I think there's real arguments now. Yeah. Okay, I think I missed one. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. Do you think the Académie Française will ever decide to get their claws into regional French languages, or will they leave well alone? That's a really interesting question. So the Académie Française exists to protect kind of the purity of French. I don't think that's incompatible with regional language policy. I think in France, uh, the Academy plays a really important role in protecting the integrity of a language that is so important and so powerful and so uh, integral to French identity, but also to the identity of other countries. So I kind of admire their work quite a lot. I don't think having a pure French version of French is incompatible with having strong regional language identity, personally. But we'll see. um, okay. Thank you, Sha. Okay. If there are no more questions, thank you so much. I feel like you've really been great at contributing and bringing that regional identity to this talk. I really hope you enjoyed the language show. As I said before, please do keep in touch. You've got my LinkedIn on there, and you can check out the British Council's web pages as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye.